Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pensive with Mr. Watson. I am indeed your host, Christian Watson, and with me today on this day, which is replete with technical difficulties, is Mr. Anthony DiMauro. I hope I'm not butchering that. He has recently written two very interesting articles in both the Orange County Register and the American Conservative, and he has also been a contributor to the program before. Well, not contributor. He appeared on the program before, talk about individuality and I forgot exactly what the details of that essay were, but it was a brilliant discussion. I encourage you to go back and listen to it. Anthony, how are you doing, my friend?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me on, Christian. Appreciate it. Love to
Awesome.
be back.
So, in my opinion, the height of humility is to admit when you are incorrect. No, I think it is. That's the height of humility. That is what I think human survival has been predicated upon. If we had a static mindset going through the world, going through the process of building civilizations, and the process of forming connections, and the process of trying to encapsulate and compartmentalize what those things are, calling it love, calling it bonding, calling it all these sort of things that we can use to prod and we can use to understand certain things. If we had a static mindset in that period of time, then I don't think that we would have made it. So I think that to continue that process of humility, to continue that process is to continue the process of growth. And so, but beyond my philosophical musings, I want to genuinely know, and you're, because, I could go on for hours about that. I want to genuinely know, Anthony, what was the tipping point? Well, first of all, explain what you were wrong about, explain why you were wrong, and explain the tipping point that brought you to that epiphany.
Sure. Well, first, I'll say one word about your philosophical musings, because I think you're exactly right. There's something to be said about being able to admit when you're wrong. I think the liberal mindset and the liberal society is the one that can self-correct. Pointing out criticism and pointing out things that can be fixed is how you function and evolve into something truly progressive. So I agree, and I was wrong. At least I think I was, regarding coronavirus. So I wrote this article in the American Conservative, aptly titled, "I warned about coronavirus, now I feel like a fool." It might be a little misleading to the extent that I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of the virus, because 100,000 people have died. But what I feel like I was wrong about was living my daily life based on the advice of these government institutions, for which are fairly compromised to a certain extent. I really do believe that. So back in January, when we first heard about this, I had no reason to doubt the World Health Organization. I had a little bit of a concern when they were touting Chinese transparency from the Chinese government, that is, and saying that it was not something to be worried about. But 14 days later, it was a global pandemic. But again, although I might not expect the same country like China who has a concentration camp of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in that country, to be very honest with the world, the World Health
the internet
Organization,
and everything like that, yeah.
The World Health Organization was supposed to be different, especially to the extent that the United States used to 22% of their total revenue. So again, I had no reason to mistrust them. But what was the tipping point, you asked? It was the discussion around the protests amongst health experts. And it felt like gaslighting, because to hear health experts and journalists at very prominent magazines and institutions in the same breath tell me Georgia is experimenting in human sacrifice, but protesters shouldn't even consider the risks of coronavirus into consideration before joining millions in the crowd. That is, if we went from shaming people who were out in the streets to shaming people who wouldn't join. To echo a recent Guardian article, I have to completely, that's something I really had trouble grappling with. And so I said, this is nonsense. Epidemiological risk does not disappear in the face of potential political gains of any kind. So that for me was the tipping point. What I was wrong about specifically was listening to the advice and practicing my daily health habits based on these government institutions, which are clearly compromised.
Compromised,
and that's really where I take a stand on.
Compromised by arrogance, compromised by
whether it's ideological, whether it's ideological agendas, whether it's foreign governments really transposing what they want to be publicized onto onto these organizations, things like that. But also just strange and bizarre happenings, like the CDC and Fauci in February tweeting, you shouldn't have to worry about wearing a mask. You don't need to worry about wearing masks. They won't help. Come to find out, it's like 80% reduction rate if everybody were to wear masks.
Precisely.
So,
and as we know, initially they banned respirators, and now we understand that respirators actually do help when they said they didn't help. So, it is my earnest opinion that everyone in a governmental position of power, everyone who has their hands on lever of power or who are close to it, are possessed by the expediency of the moment, or the expediency that will further their grip or their closeness towards that power. It's a sort of corruption almost of the self within a certain temporal moment, which guides your actions and corrupts your will to doing things that may not be ethically or morally, cosmically correct, but instead temporally and situationally correct. And of course, as we understand, there is not really a connection between what is temporally or situationally correct and what is a cosmic truth. And so this is precisely why I said about Fauci, when he was suggesting that we keep America continually shut down and everything, that, you are a doctor, you're an epidemiologist, and I trust you in that sense. But if you're going to postulate public policy, you must have a grasp of the framework in which we conduct public policy. And if you do not, you have absolutely no business postulating crap, jack shit. Sorry to be vulgar, but it's the truth. And so Fauci clearly didn't take time to read the Constitution. He clearly didn't take time to understand the underlying tenets of America's existence. He clearly didn't take time to embrace the fullness of the American experiment. He decided to hijack the experiment, jump on the train, and try to steer it off into a railroad that would have sent us straight to oblivion. So I think that you are absolutely correct. When you have political expediency there, when you have a prize there, a trophy, folks will oftentimes be more focused on the trophy than what is actually ethically correct.
And a sad, and that's a really good point, but a sad effect of all this is that, there has been a war on so-called experts for a while, and there's been a prevalence of anti-intellectualism on the right, amongst conservatives, even just right-leaning libertarians to a certain extent. And I have been really fighting against that notion that we should respect educational institutions and expertise. For what is the point of having them but to allow them to guide public discourse, or at least present informed informational knowledge that is based on things that they've been studying for years and years and years. And now this is just a perfect example for everybody who wants expert credibility to be lost, because in some way it should be lost in this. I mean, it's their own doing. And you see the news cycle when Trump had restarted his so-called MAGA rallies. Everybody was right back to the headlines we're reading, despite coronavirus, and of course, how can you blame, whether your political expediency aside, how can you blame people for supporting and going to those rallies when just weeks before it wasn't even worth considering coronavirus as danger when protesting for other political causes?
Of course.
Again, and this has nothing to do with the political content. This is just, as you said, health advice, policy advice, or not. It's either the virus is dangerous and deadly, or it's not. It can't shift with the tides of ideological fervor.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And when you mention fervor is fickle. Fervor is fickle because it is a certain circumstance is what produces fervor, a enhanced, heightened circumstance. And as we understand, all circumstances are fleeting. I think Sartre was actually correct here in a sense. Now, he wasn't correct on the sort of epistemological root of this, because when he said in the Nausea that the past is non-existent, it's an illusion, I don't think he's correct on that. But he is correct in that this moment that we exist in is fleeting. And when you predicate notions that will be less fleeting, that will exist for a little bit longer than the regular moment in the Sartrean lexicon, what you do is you sort of set yourself up for a calamity. And so I think that, I think that's absolutely correct. And the political thing aside, you're right. it's about philosophical consistency. If there is truly a public health threat to the American experiment, if there is truly a threat to the American mind, if there is truly a threat to individual health, then if you really care about that threat, as the media so proclaimed they did, as CNN, I remember watching it before I was kicked out of my dorms, or not kicked out, before I left my dorm because of I wasn't kicked out. My university was actually pretty good on that. It was actually pretty good on that. The president fought tooth and nail to keep us there. I love him for that. When I decided to leave the dorm because I figured it was not expeditious to my health or to my growth as a human being to stay there, I remember watching every night. Don Lemon was on the TV with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and they were just talking, the coronavirus. It was coronavirus 24/7. But when these protests happened, number one, the rate of coverage for coronavirus actually declined. Number two, the rate of coverage for these protests overwhelmingly favorably, actually increased. And even on the right, even on Fox News, even on a lot of these places, the coronavirus was not really mentioned as a critique of these protests. So both sides literally put down the reality of what was happening, and they embraced a relative space in which they ensconced themselves in and used the energy of that relative space to drive forth narratives that had absolutely nothing to do with this pandemic until it was convenient for them, or at least I will say until it was convenient for the left particularly. But the right has a little bit of shame in this as well. So my question for you is, what is going on? Why do you think folks are so easily able to weave between reality and narratives, or reality and fantasy within political context, and sort of use that magic of relativism? Because it is a magic, really, I think. And people might think my terms are odd or weird. Don't think I'm crazy, but it is a certain kind of magic. Because magic in the traditional sense, if you were to understand the ancient text of Wicca, if you were to understand all that stuff, is simply imprinting your will upon reality and shifting it, shifting the tides of the universe. So in a sense, these people are engaging in a form of magic when they shift the tides of the political universe. Why do you think that is so easily and so little absconded and admonished by people in our current political context?
Well, I mean, that's honestly a loaded question, but I think
yes,
that
it is.
if we're talking about, I mean,
yes.
you could probably write a fairly long essay, if not a
yes.
chapter in a book on this. But my quick bite answer would be something along the lines of considering what politics is in its current situation. So, of course, politics kept completely neutral and kept and conflated with ethical judgments. That is, if you believe in X policy, you're also proclaiming a moral instantiation. Mm-hmm. So that is, you hear Bernie Sanders talk. I think this really has to do with this conflation between politics and morality. You hear Bernie Sanders talk about, it's immoral to not have universal health care.
Right.
And anyone who opposes this universal health care policy is immoral. And I think that that's just a category mistake, because when you hear, for example, let's just take an example, climate change. That's another moralized topic. If you could, let's suppose person A wants to ban all fossil fuels to and impose, something like the Green New Deal, but they want the government to do it, and they want it to be a top-down implementation. And then person B says, yes, there is a climate issue, but I want some sort of market-oriented solution to this. It's not that the person who disagrees with the Green New Deal proponent is immoral. They both actually value the same thing, that is the health of the environment. And
the value statement is the same. The value statement is the same.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just different ways of approaching that. So again, to say that your political enemy is your moral enemy is a complete category mistake. And again, when you make that conflation, though, however, it's all about moral superiority and moral power. So what does that mean? That means narratives, especially political ones, are about dominance and power. So of course, if these health experts are viewing what is a protest and focusing solely on the political contents of that protest and happen to find that protest righteous, like many people do, including myself, to say that they shouldn't do that for even health risks, in fact, the risks that they as experts are supposed to observe, would be to cede ideological and political power, because to oppose it would be ethically compromisable. So again, I think that is my shorthand answer as to how these ideological narratives can infiltrate epistemological ones, or just truth value policy. So I think that's my answer. The conflation between politics and morals. There's something deeply connected between the two, no doubt. But to say they are the same, again, I think is a category mistake.
Well, absolutely. It's I mean, because essentially, I would say that the undergirding, the principle that undergirds most political discussions, especially most political ideologies, are value statements, right? So the idea of positive rights, which the Democratic Party postulates a lot, and sometimes Republicans postulate a lot, that undergirds a sort of society, a sort of allegiance to society, sort of allegiance to utility, almost, if you want to talk about pure ethical values. Because these things, these sort of, by voting, women's rights, all these positive rights have a certain utility towards them that supposedly improves the greater good. So at the very bedrock, the nadir of political formation, I do think that there are certain constants, there are certain ideas, but of course, on the surface, when we're talking very surface level, because Bernie Sanders saying that you're immoral if you don't support universal health care is an incredibly shallow statement.
I should actually qualify. I mean, single payer healthcare, because I think everybody wants universal healthcare.
Well, single payer, yeah.
Everybody wants people to be covered if possible. I don't think there are many. I would say the vast majority of people wants to see a society in which individuals who need medical care in a position able to achieve to get that medical care. However, sure, Bernie Sanders holds single payer as that solution, and let's say someone on the right probably holds a market-oriented solution. Again, different solutions, but they both value the same thing.
The same value statement, correct.
These are political enemies, but not moral enemies.
So the shallow waters kind of obscure the true intents of these people. You think the shallow waters of politics kind of obscure the true intentions? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's in part probably deliberative. I mean, if you can make your political enemy a moral enemy, there's great power in that. Again, so to a certain extent, it's.
You said something that caught my ear, and I'm not sure most folks would have picked up on it, because most folks, of course, a lot of folks that listen to Pensive Politics even are not really philosophy students or philosophers. They are people who are simply trying to get a different take on the news, different take on what's going on. And I certainly hope I do my best in giving them that. So you mentioned power. You basically said political narratives are all about power. That sounds very Foucaultian to me. So why don't you explain that? I'm curious about that one, because I made my ears jump a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. No. What I was trying to say was political narratives are only about power once they are conflated with ethics, because I think, again,
there you go.
That's where they are. So that's why, and I think that's a common theme today, at this conflation between politics and ethics, and that's why we see these power politics playing out.
Okay.
So the claim wasn't that politics period is. So, I mean, to a certain extent, call it Foucaultian. He would certainly say that there's power involved in every form of political enterprise. But I'm making a qualified statement right now that just when you conflate it with ethical claims, that's where the power plays really come out.
Yeah, precisely. Now, I have a question for you, though, about the ethical claims. Do you think that, so the statement of we hold these truths to be self-evident is an ethical, that's actually that's a qualifier for an ethical statement to be made. It's a sort of precursor for an ethical statement to be made, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among those being life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The entire preamble is an ethical statement. But it appears to me that statement is a negation of potential power that would seek to encroach upon the foundation of what that statement affirms. That statement affirms the natural foundation of human liberty. That statement affirms the natural foundation of the rights composition, which allows our flesh and animates our bodies to exist in this world, according to that doctrine. I believe that doctrine. And so that statement is a negative statement. And for everyone who doesn't know that means Anthony, I'm sure he positively sure he does. A negative statement is simply a statement that restricts someone. It's a negation. It's a lack of action, so to speak. That's a negative statement. And so are you to say that all ethical political statements are positive statements? Because if you were to say that when ethics is paired with politics, you would be insinuating that it is a positive statement, that it is an interventionist and an involved statement. But I find that, and oftentimes that's not the case all the time, especially when it comes to fundamental principle.
Sorry, you cut out a little bit there, but I just want to make sure I got the question right. Are you asking if I think that ethics in relation to politics is all about negative versus positive statements?
No. I'm asking if you think that ethics paired with politics is almost always a positive, i.e. an involved interventionist sort of postulation, as opposed to a negative one, which negates power, which negates involvement. Because when you say that when ethics is paired with politics, it's primarily about power, that suggests some sort of involvement. That suggests a sort of positive value. And I'm just very curious about that because Yeah, go on.
Super complicated. So yes. I don't know if I'm truly going to answer your question, but I think there's, and this, again, an interesting analysis of this actually comes from Max Weber. He had a pretty unique view of ethics and politics. He thought that there was a complete conflict between certain value spheres. He rejected the idea that politics could build on ethical foundations. And I think that he had something right, because he talked about politics as having two different types of ethics. There was a ethic of conviction and an ethic of responsibility. Now, whether you agree with his analysis of those two, even taking the terms on their face, I think there's something interesting to that, because there are convictions that each of us hold, I'm sure, right? And then there are responsibilities by which we get from living in a society. Most people would agree with those two very basic claims, that even those who are only in favor of negative values would say, yeah, I have a responsibility to not harm my neighbor. Okay. But I also have moral convictions. Like I have moral convictions, like beliefs in God or non-beliefs. Again, those two things I think come into conflict a lot. I think Max Weber was absolutely right. I think that you look at any type of, the LGBT Q plus issue around bakers baking gay cakes. That's a perfect example.
Baking gay cakes.
Baking cakes for gay weddings.
My Lord, I never heard of it. No.
A Freudian, that was some sort of a slip. But I will tell you, but what I mean is, as that being a good example of what I'm talking about, is that the baker clearly has convictions, right? Yeah. And so does the couple who wants to buy a cake. They both have their own personal convictions. And then there's supposed to be this overarching ethic of responsibility that's supposed to sort of mitigate conflicts between those convictions. But I don't think it does a very good job at doing that, because we have a different, I think that nobody, on the one hand, people would say that that's discriminatory, and I have some sort of, and he as a baker and a member of society has some sort of responsibility not to discriminate against me. And that baker has the other version of that is, no, I have my own personal convictions, and you have a responsibility not to violate those convictions, just like I wouldn't violate yours. So again, I think that that's a pretty good way, and this is a super rough sketch. Again, this is just podcast off the top of my head bites on what I'm thinking about this. But when I think through these issues, I think it's a good way to understand the way that ethics interacts with politics, that ethic of conviction, that ethic of responsibility.
Right. And I do think that, and as you said, it's a very rough sketch, because there's a lot of considerations about this, especially when you get into deeper political theory. There's all kind of theorists and philosophers that postulate certain ethical systems that do so from a sort of deontological view, from a consequentialist view. It's a lot of stuff. And we haven't even mentioned virtue ethics and the virtue ethicists that are currently in American politics and academia trying to push their idea. We haven't even mentioned that. So there's a very, 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 very deep sort of ocean of knowledge. But I think you have answered my question in part, at least for the purposes of this podcast. You have said no. You have.
We can forward this conversation.
The cosmic question is obviously still out there. It's probably not going to be solved by us. It's probably not going to be solved by us, because it's certainly, it's something that I grapple with personally as well. But the answer seems to be that yes, there is a mixture within ethical political thinking of positive and negative values coming into conflict and forming opinions and forming actions and motivating certain things to happen. And that for now, that's a fine answer. because for now it is. It is for now. It's a fine answer because it's. I think it's number one. I think it's observable, and number two, it kind of gives people a dynamic sense in which sort of a dynamic incubator in which political action can be conceived, which can make people feel, which can sort of break the more shallow surface of this dichotomy, which would manifest in the form of Republican and Democratic parties. The party system itself is a sort of shallow form of the conglomerate between ethics and politics, I think. Because what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to be avatars of certain opinions. But organizations are simply compositions of individuals, and individuals change their opinions all the time. And when you are in a political system, there are also many other motives that are motivating you other than conviction. So the lie of conviction is kind of what has, in my opinion, produced shallowness in politics. The lie of conviction, filtered through the parties, not filtered, exuded by the parties. What do you think about that postulation?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it. I think you nailed it when you discussed political parties serving as avatars. You see this through debates about political histories. Oh, the Republican Party is responsible for this. No, the Democratic Party really was responsible for this. None of it seems to add or map on correctly because, of course, like you said, political parties evolve over time. JFK certainly doesn't look like anything that a contemporary Democratic
he does not
for office looks like today. And I'm certain Abraham Lincoln, because he seems to be just perpetually brought up by the president, doesn't look like anything that we're seeing out of the GOP.
Of course, he doesn't. Thankfully.
So again, we are well. That's an opinion I don't know if I'd share, but still, either way, you're absolutely right in the observation that these political parties serving as avatars is a bit misleading to the extent that they're always evolving.
Well, let me elaborate on that because I don't want people to think I'm some sort of pro-slavery, neo-Confederate guy hiding beneath the veneer of a black student. No. That's not. That's not what I am. I think that Abraham Lincoln was a man who had higher order ideas and aspired to higher order values. I mean, you've listened to any of that guy. You read any of that guy's speeches, any of his correspondences. He's always talking about the founding. He's always talking about something greater than himself. So that's very virtuous. But in my opinion, when you go down and you seize newspapers and you destroy businesses and you just arrest people who have a different opinion about the war than you do in a land that is supposed to stand against the Confederacy, which was an avatar of destruction and dictatorial sort of nonsense and fetishism against black folks, you betray those higher order principles you were talking about. And so I don't see Lincoln as a saint. I see him as someone who is certainly better than the alternative. I don't see him as an evil, so to speak. I don't believe in that dichotomy of lesser two evils, but I see him as someone who made incredibly bad and ethically questionable decisions amid a war effort to inspire public morale. Now, there can be an argument made that if public morale is not inspired, the war machine falls, and the higher order ideals that Lincoln postulated through the machinery of the Union would have fell as well. I understand that argument. That's a very important point to bring up, but it does not justify, in my opinion, violating inviolable rights which compose the essence of humanity. And so that's my issue with Lincoln. And I'm happy that, well, I can't say the Republican Party is not like that today. I can't say that, actually. I prematurely spoke. I can't say that.
Civil asset forfeiture. That's a good segue. The seizure of property that you were.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, and we'll wrap up in a few moments because I know you got to go. I got to go. But civil forfeiture is one of those issues that makes me wonder, how have we fallen so far from, I'm not going to say what the meme says. The meme with the Kermit and how he fallen so far from God. I'm not going to say that. How have we fallen just so far from the aspiration of property as an extension of our natural freedom in this country, which our country is predicated upon? I mean, literally, our Constitution says you cannot unlawfully quarter in my house. I have to give you my permission. You cannot take my property. I have to give you my permission. You have to do it through a just means, so due process. And unfortunately, asset forfeiture, as many libertarians, as many astute observers of the American tradition will understand, is a dereliction of the inherent ideological presuppositions of the American experiment. So tell us what you wrote about in the Orange County Register, which is a fair publication in my opinion. I think they do some great work over there. Tell us exactly. Just give me a synopsis of your
Sure. Yeah.
of your argument. Yeah, for the viewers.
Yeah. So I just bemoaned the rot on civil liberties that civil asset forfeiture really is. First of all, it's worth noting that this isn't something that is just opposed by one side or the other. A recent
Right.
poll, I think it was a couple years ago, 84% of people oppose this practice.
It's bipartisan.
So you would think in the conversation of police reform, this is one of the first things that should go. If you want a quick history of civil asset forfeiture, Heritage has a really good blog on this, surprisingly enough. They put up a piece and they explain how it actually has its roots in forfeiture law of ships, seizure of products coming into the United States from years ago. So this was mostly about cargo and vessel forfeiture, and it obviously got bloviated in the 1970s with the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, and only continued to broaden itself through the 80s and, of course, the 90s with the war on drugs. Today, there are two types of asset forfeiture. There's the criminal asset forfeiture, which is usually, very straightforward, that once you're convicted of a crime, any contraband connected or instrumentalities connected are seized. Now, civil asset forfeiture, this is where all this horrible abuse that I highlighted in the article comes about, because this type of forfeiture, civil asset forfeiture, it's seizure of personal property without conviction. I mean, that should in and of itself fly in the face of anybody who has any sort of idea of personal liberty and property rights, right? This is just the government taking property from lawfully innocent people. They're not convicted of any crime. In fact, a lot aren't even charged. If you look at Missouri, I highlighted in the article, they coerced at least 39 motorists into signing over a total of like $2.3 million of their personal property. Most of it's cash. And where does it go? It goes right into the pockets of the same state, local, and federal departments that are needing money. So these people are actually funding department budgets. I mean, and you can look at the abuses of that. I mean, the Manhattan DA in New York, where I am, spent $250,000 was found to have spent $250,000 of forfeiture funds on luxury travel and dining. People's life savings are being taken away because they're suspected of a crime. Okay, 9 in 10 cases that are brought to court to challenge. 9 in 10 cases of this are never receive justice because they can't even bring them to court to challenge because of the insurmountable costs on top of the personal property costs they've just incurred. And last point, in the article, I highlighted Chicago, which is particularly bad. Reasons CJ Ciaramillo wrote a fantastic article exposing this type of property seizure. Between 2012 and 2017, the Chicago Police Department seized over $150 million worth of personal property. If you look from 2005 to 2015, the number jumps to $319 million. And this is, 6,000 vehicles, Xbox controllers, majority like $1,000 clumps of cash. And where does it primarily hurt demographically and socioeconomically? Poor neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods. So again, to a certain extent, this is not only a rot on civil liberties, but a rot on racial equality. So this is really just a horrible practice, flat out. So that's sort of my quick synopsis.
Right. And in my opinion, I think that the deontological claim, for folks who don't know who that is, deontological is simply as it relates to ethics or rules, as it relates to like sort of established concrete principles. In a very simple way, principle and consequentialist, circumstance or effect, principle effect, sort of a dichotomy there. The deontological claim that it is a violation of civil liberties is much more resounding to me, because the rot on those things is quite literally a rot on the human condition. Liberty, in my estimation, is the vector for the human condition to flourish in the natural world. And so when you rot liberty, you rot life. When you rot life, we die. And death is a natural part of life, but it's not when it's premature. So, I mean, when it's premature, it's a kind of an aberration of the natural order and the natural laws, so to speak. But I do think, for messaging purposes, pushing civil asset forfeiture as a race issue may have some merit. Although I do think that it ultimately takes away from the power that the more deontological approach would have. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think this is just a pretty factual claim. I mean, you hear this talk a lot, but this
Sure.
civil asset forfeiture disproportionately affects minority communities. I mean, that is
Sure.
indisputable. What you want to
It
do
is.
with that information, so do with what you will. But to bring that up, I think is important to at least understand how this works and how really it plays into the broader conversation that we're having today about police reform. Which is
Right.
largely seen as a racial equality issue. Again, whether you see merit to that or not, this fact of the matter is motivating people to want to get rid of this practice, which is a good thing.
All right, Anthony, you are great, my friend. I hope I can have you
Thank
back
you for
again.
having me on again.
Oh,
Yeah,
no, it is a pleasure. You are always fun to talk to. You're always fun to talk to, seriously. Would you have any last words before we go? Because I know you got to go. I got to go. So any last words before we go?
No, just thanks. Thanks for keep doing what you do. And I'll be looking forward to listening to your future interviews.
Thank you so much. And as always, guys, please stay pensive.